I'm going to be giving you some tools so that at the end of this session, you can walk away and know, I have to do this. It's not going to be a lot of theory-based concepts. It's going to be a lot of, this is exactly what to do. So I want you to actually have all of the information that you need in as simple a format as possible. So if you are ready to get started, pop a yes into chat for me and we will get going. Yes, from Kevin, great. Awesome. Okay. Absolutely, from Jefferson, yes, from Kimberly, great stuff, guys. Okay, so let me share my screen with you. What we're going to do is I'm going to go through and give you some very specific information, and then we're going to see how that applies to you. So the beauty of being here live for this training is that you can take your own experiences and raise any questions that you have in relation to your own public speaking experiences. So let's jump straight in. So for those of you who don't know me, I am actually a reformed, terrified public speaker. And I used to be absolutely nauseated by the idea of speaking in public. And this one lesson changed everything for me. It made me completely refocus myself on how I was treating my public speaking fear, which was super debilitating. And that one concept is this understanding that public speaking fear is actually a learned behavior. Before I got this, I thought public speaking was a skill that you were either born with or you weren't. I didn't really even envisage that it was something that was a skill like any other skill. And the interesting thing about public speaking fear is that it's something that we've learnt as we've grown from infancy to adulthood. And because it's something that we have learnt, it is also something that can be unlearned. So it's an approach or a mindset that we've gathered along the way. And the fabulous thing, and the part that made a big difference to me, was understanding not only was it something I had learnt to do, it's something I can actually unlearn or learn a better way of doing. See, the thing is, we're taught from a really young age, not necessarily consciously, but certainly environmentally, that we shouldn't be speaking. But when you think about when we're actually all born with the ability to make our needs and our wants really, really clear to people. And babies, when you think about babies, they have no hesitation in opening their mouth and talking to people, right? They're really confident about expressing themselves. So what happens after a baby's born and they learn to express themselves, then we move into the toddler phase. And if you've got kids, you'll know that we spend a lot of time teaching our toddlers how to talk. And once we've taught them how to talk, you know what we do after that? We tell them to shut up because they just go on and on and on and on. So after we've taught our toddlers to talk and then we're sick of them talking, that pattern or that environmental, I like to call it indoctrination to some extent, is actually continued through the school system. So school kids, when you're in school, in most of the school systems, you are taught to sit down and shut up. In fact, you're not allowed to talk unless you're given permission to do so. And for many people, this is where their fear of public speaking actually begins, when they are found out or called out for talking to people when they shouldn't be talking. So often that's the first experience that we have as people who are starting to feel that talking is an uncomfortable experience. It's something that we are mocked for or humiliated for, and we're called out for in the school system. So when I say it's environmental and it's a behavior that is learnt or a fear that is learnt, that's what I'm really talking about. Often for people, it starts in the school system. So it's not always the case. So, some of us go through the school system feeling really comfortable about speaking in public, and then something else happens that actually impacts on us. So I've put together this program, which I'm going to go through part of for you today, and then I'll do the other half in another session. But I want this to help you to combat what I've broken down, the 7 key fear symptoms that people have when they're thinking about talking in public. So before we go further, because I did say this was a workshop based, I'd like you to, hi Lisa, welcome. I'd like you to pop in the chat for me when it is that you can first remember being uncomfortable about the idea of speaking in public. What was it? How old were you when that experience actually happened? Now, for me, it was high school, and I was in high school. And before I'd gone to high school, I was actually doing School of the Air because I lived out in the middle of the Pilliga scrub. And I was a real country girl on a farm, and I didn't actually start proper high school until I was 14. And when I went to high school in a brand new place with a whole bunch of people, because I'd done my schooling prior to that time on my own through School of the Air, I didn't have a lot of social skills. So what that meant was I thought everybody was going to like me, and I was like this big Labrador puppy. I wanted to bounce up to people and have them all talk to me and all like me. Now, if you've ever been a teenager, you know that is not how most teenagers go. They're very cliquey and they form friendships. And because I started in year 9, all of those friendships had already been formed. So I was constantly excluded, isolated, and really socially lonely. So I started to learn at that point that nobody wanted to hear from me. So for me, that's when my public speaking fear started. And that kind of escalated and became really difficult. So I was about 14 or so. So pop in the chat for me how old you were when you started to feel kind of uncomfortable about the idea of speaking in public, because that'll give us a good idea on where your fear symptoms might have started. So I'll get you to pop that in there and we'll come back to that. So from high school or from primary school, so Lisa says she's not sure how old she was, but I was always a very shy kid. Awesome. Thank you, Lisa, for having the courage to share that with us today. I appreciate it. So you're going to go along through this process, Lisa, and you might find we're going to cover 3 of the big 7 fears today. I want you to think about this as we go through, as for everybody. I want you to think about which one of these kind of grabs you and says, yes, that's me. Because there will be one of these 7 fears that will be your most dominant fear. And once you understand your most dominant fear, then it's a lot easier to actually resolve that for you. So Kevin says, no memory of fear. Yeah, the way just looking to improve how you can do it better. Actually understanding that is a really powerful process as well, Kevin. You might find as you go along, you understand that there are actually things in here that you weren't aware of that make you a bit nervous. Thank you for sharing that. Kimberly, you're doing news or show and tell. Oh, yes, a good old show and tell during school. That's always good fun. Okay, so let's jump in now. Before we can beat our fear of public speaking, we have to work out what the actual symptoms are. And I like to think about this along the lines of going to the doctors. When you go to the doctors, you don't just sit there and your doctor, psychically evaluates why you're there. What they do is they ask you about your symptoms, right? And they do this because they need to find out what's the real cause of your problem so that they can give you the right solution. Now, once we know what your fear symptoms are based on, what's the most dominant fear system, we can work out what the cause is, and then you can have the tools to fix them. But if you've got a cough, you don't necessarily need the cure for leprosy, right? You've got to match up your symptoms and your cure together, your symptoms and your signs, sorry. So to make this concept a bit easier to handle, I've developed this model called the 7 flavors of fear, and it breaks the public speaking fear symptoms down into 7 categories. And if you should have got a text message with this at some point today that you can download. It will look like this. If you don't have that, pop a yes into the chat so that we can make sure you get a copy of it. And Jefferson, says not fear of talking, but freak out to face outstanding audiences. What's an outstanding audience, Jefferson? Could you just give me a definition of that in the chat?
Mostly people that have a lot of understanding about the topic.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah, so
Gotcha. Okay. Ah,
skilled audiences, let's put in this way.
yes, skilled audience, yes. I think what we're going to call that fear is actually a fear of credibility, and that's actually one we're going to cover as well. So I think you'll get some good value out of that, Jefferson. Thank you. And Lisa, we'll send that to you again. Okay, so the first flavor of fear we're going to have a look today is fear of your audience. And this might be one that you've got as well, Jefferson, where this fear is based on the belief that the audience is somehow out to get you. And what I mean by that is that they're either hostile or they know more than you know and they're going to try and catch you out, or they want you to fail and they are fully prepared to mock you when you do fail. So these are the thoughts that go around in people's heads when they're afraid of the audience. They're concerned about standing up in front of people because they think the audience is going to mock them. That's what it really boils down to. So what your head's really saying to you is the audience is the enemy. So this is a really important fear to understand. And it's probably one of the most common ones as well. If you think this is one of your biggest fears, and hopefully you've got something to write on, pen and paper or a device of some sort, if you've got this as one of your biggest fears, just note down audience fear so that you've got that down there. And we've got at the end, we've got a PDF for you as well, which will have the fear symptoms and the solution for you. So it's good to know in advance which are your most dominant fears. So here's the truth, guys. The truth is your audience is not really concerned about you. They're only concerned about themselves. In fact, give me a yes if you've ever been in an audience as a witness to somebody else speaking and you've been on the receiving end of a really nervous, uncomfortable, unprepared, unprofessional speaker. Has anybody ever been in that situation before? Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like you to pop in the chat for me. How do you feel when you are an audience member or a witness to somebody who's speaking poorly, who's clearly nervous, who's stuttering, stumbling over their words, they've got bad slides, they're really uncomfortable? How do you feel as an audience member? What are your thoughts and impressions? Kimberly, have you been in that situation? You said you had, so just want to unmute yourself and tell me how you felt as an audience member.
I felt a little bit sorry for the speaker because they were so nervous and they stumbled over, they didn't know their content. So that was a bit embarrassing for them as well. So, yeah,
Absolutely. And
I felt really bad for them.
felt bad for them. And what did you want to happen?
I guess just for them to be a little bit more confident and deliver what they knew.
And why did you want that? Why did you want your speaker to be more confident? What was it that was prompting that?
Well, I was hoping that they knew what they were talking about.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's beautifully summed up. Thanks, Kimberly. So and as Jefferson said, you felt all the speaker's tension and you felt frustrated about the speaker. And Lisa said that, she wants to support them however you can. And like that's three totally different people's responses. And it all comes down to one thing. And that one thing is we do not want the person who's speaking to us to fail. We don't want them to fail because it makes us uncomfortable. It makes us feel stressed. It makes us feel nervous. It makes us want the whole thing to be over. Most people are feeling quite compassionate towards that speaker in the initial stages. And then as time goes on, they start to feel more and more stressed and frustrated. And it's a relief to everybody when the whole thing's over. But it's not because the audience wants you to fail. It's because you are failing and the audience is responding to that failure. So it's the cause and effect concept. The audience does not want you to fail, but if you do fail, they actually want you to be successful. So every one of those comments from that question came back to us feeling bad for the speaker who's actually failing or being uncomfortable on the stage or in front of us. So that's important to understand, because once we recognize that the audience is actually only concerned about how you're impacting on them, it helps us to fix that fear. So the way that we actually go ahead and fix that fear is to understand, firstly, the audience does not want you to fail. In fact, they're only there to find out what it is you're talking about. The fact that you're delivering it is nowhere near as important to an audience as what you are talking about. And what they want to know is, what's the impact of this content on me? What does it mean to me? Is it going to be good for me? Is it going to be bad for me? And all of their focus is really just on themselves. And you're just the delivery vehicle. If you do a good job delivering it, then that makes them feel more confident and more comfortable being in your audience. If you do a poor job delivering it, they're going to get not as much out of the content, which means that they're not going to get as much out of the experience. So the audience is actually rooting for you to be successful. So the way to handle this is to understand and to remind yourself before you go out and speak in front of a group of people, whether it's on stage, in a martial arts class, whether you're in a board meeting or a team meeting, remember that your audience is cheering you on. They want you to succeed. They do not want you to fail. This is a powerful way to actually handle fear of your audience. So this is what you need to do. Remember, I said to you I was going to give you the exactly what to do. I want you to catch your thoughts. And I want you to change your focus. And I invite you to do this because it will help you to address the fear of audience really, really quickly. So instead of thinking, wow, that looks like a crowd of people who know a lot more than I do about this topic, or that looks like a group of people who are going to be looking at me and I don't like it when people look at me, or gee, I think they're going to be judging me about what I'm wearing, how I look, how I've done my hair, any of those things. When you catch yourself thinking about that, try and take a step back and observe your thoughts. When you catch yourself thinking anything outside of this one sentence, redirect, refocus back to this one sentence. This one sentence is, how can I help this audience today? And repeat that for you. How can I help this audience today? So Jefferson, when you're talking about a group of people who you feel might be more skillful than you, that's an opportunity for you to say, how can I help this audience today? Now, it might be a way of putting the content in a way that they hadn't heard before. It might be a way of reminding them of concepts that they have done and should be doing now, but they're no longer doing for whatever reason. All of these things, if you put it into this little bubble and say, how can I help this audience today? It totally changes your mental state when you go in front of people and talk. Because instead of it being all about you, instead it's all about your audience. And when you step outside your head and start thinking about how you can help people, it totally changes your whole mindset. So can everybody see how that works? Give me a yes in the chat or a thumbs up if you can see how that works. And just so I know you've got it, what is the sentence that you need to use to redirect your thoughts with? See if I can make sure everyone's got that down there. What do you say instead? How can I help the audience? That's right, Jefferson. It is a good insight, isn't it? It's not about you, it's about them. They want to know what you can help them with. And this doesn't matter whether you're telling somebody or a group of people. This is one-to-one or one-to-many. It doesn't matter what you're telling them. Doesn't matter if it's good news or bad news, if you're doing redundancies or layoffs or disciplinary actions or introducing new concept or new technology or new principles, whatever it is you're talking about, the audience is really thinking, what does it mean to me? So if you can put that content in a way that's easy for your audience to understand and helps them to get from where they are now to where they need to be, and you focus on that journey of the audience, it really helps to overcome the fear of the audience, because suddenly the audience is somebody that you're there to help. Okay, so let's jump into the next fear then. So we're refocusing for fear of audience. We're refocusing onto how can I help this group. Next up, we have anticipation fear. Now this fear, it's a doozy. And this is the one that keeps you awake for days and weeks and all those sleepless nights that happen before you do a presentation of any sort, and then afterwards as well. And this one thrives on worrying about and populating your brain with every possible disaster scenario that could happen before or during your talk. Now, when this fear comes to life, it's usually about the same time that you find out that you might have to do a presentation or that you do have to do a presentation. So somebody says, hey, it's time for you to do a presentation, and all of a sudden these anticipation fears come up and you start to think about all of the things that could go wrong. Now, I like to call this a greedy little fear because it sucks up all of your focus and you get so trapped in the whole mindset of everything that could possibly go wrong that you end up with almost no attention put onto the presentation itself and the preparation of the presentation itself. So this is how we handle that fear. And it's really simple and it's really powerful. And we're going to do this one together. So hopefully everyone's got a writing device of some sort. And what we're going to do is write down all of the things that could possibly go wrong when you have to do a presentation. Then we're going to pop these into chat and we're going to write down everything that could possibly go wrong. You could forget, and I want you to go crazy with this and be really wild. So for example, I forgot to put on my pants before I stood up in front of people, okay? That's one of the things that could go wrong. I forgot to brush my hair. I put on my clothes backwards. I forgot everything that I had prepared. There's no electricity. There's no internet. What are some of the things that could possibly go wrong when you have to speak to people in public? So let's all pop into the chat something that could go wrong. Jefferson, actually, I'm going to ask you to unmute and tell me what you think could go wrong when you're speaking to your group of experts.
As I think the most fear, and the first thing that I think that might goes wrong is totally blank, totally lost the track.
So
As much as you prepare yourself, sometimes you, oh my God, what should talk now? What's the next one? And you just become lost in your speech.
Yeah, that's common. Boy, that's happened to me. I actually have had that fear a lot, so I understand that one. So yeah, that whole I've forgotten everything fear, that's actually one of our fears itself. Just gonna grab my sheet here. It's called the forgetful fear on your sheet, if you've got that one there.
Okay.
That's a really good one. Thank you for sharing. Kimberly says she's afraid she's going to freeze. And what does a freeze look like for you, Kimberly?
Yeah, forget your information that you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. That's at a biological level, isn't it? I've completely forgotten everything. I'm in flight or fight mode. What do I do? What do I do? And so that's actually your biological reaction to a fear stimulus. You switch from your higher brain to your limbic brain or your reptilian brain, and your reptilian brain's focused only on one thing, and that's keeping you safe. And safety to your reptilian brain is run or fight or freeze. So freeze is a really common one. Thank you for sharing that. Who have we got? Lisa, not being able to answer their questions. Oh, it's such a great answer. Thank you, Lisa. Fear of not being able to answer their questions. And I'm not actually including that in today's session. I'm going to give you a quick response to that right now. Here's the most powerful expression you can ever use if you come across a question at the end of the presentation or during a presentation that you do not have the answer to. And that's a great question, Lisa. I'm going to do some research and get back to you with a properly prepared answer. Okay, so that's a great question. Congratulate them on asking a great question. That's really important because they feel, oh, that's pretty cool. And they say, I'm going to get back to you with that. And the third step of that process, so thank them, tell them you're going to get the information. And the third part is get the information to them afterwards, right? You're not expected to know everything. You're not Google. So it's not outside the realms of possibility. It's not unexpected that you're going to be able to go and get that information and give it back to them. So that's really important. Neve says, at school I was prone to crying because I worked myself up so much during the days leading up to it. I was so emotional I could just cry. And that's one of the ways, that's a really good response too. That's one of the ways that we do actually get rid of our emotions. And what we're talking about with emotions of fear, they're based on two primary hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. When your system's flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, it's a movement hormone. And if you're standing still or sitting still talking to people, you've got no ability to make movement, then your body is just generating and storing all of this excess of hormone. And sometimes the only way to get rid of it is to cry. It's actually a way of your body coping with all of that adrenaline in your system. Full fear. You might want to give me a definition of that, please, Kevin. Oh, I'm glad that was helpful, Lisa. Fabulous. Okay, so we've got all of the things that we could possibly have that are going to potentially cause us problems. The reason that I want you to write it down is, and this is really important, when you put those fears into a written format, what you are doing is taking them out of your head and you're putting them onto paper. So they're no longer in your head, they're on your paper. And certain things happen when you do that. Firstly, they become more manageable because you can see them instead of feeling them. So it engages your higher brain function. So now instead of feeling the fear in your limbic brain, you're looking at it on paper as something that you can manage more easily. Secondly, it's externalizing the fears. So while your fears are all internal and they're stabbing you in the heart and they're giving you palpitations and making you sweat and making your voice clearer, your mouth dry out and your voice stop with your words and stop with your throat sort of goes over like this and you can't really focus, all of those symptoms that I just demonstrated there. When those things are happening and you've put those thoughts and fears on paper, what you're doing is giving yourself that as an external problem. It's no longer internal, it's now external. When something's external, you're in a more logical place to be able to resolve that. It's no longer part of you. So what we're going to do is to have those fears written down. And when they're written down, that's when you can start solving them. So when they're internal, you're feeling them. When they're external and put down on paper or your tablet in front of you, then you can look at it and go, okay, problem is here. Now I can look at a solution. Just like we did at that one for Lisa about how do I handle questions if somebody's asked that I don't know the answer to. So once your fears are written down, you can start thinking about the solutions. So I'm going to give you some other fears that you might have when you are thinking about all of the things that could possibly go wrong during your presentation or during the time that you're asked to speak. Judgment. You could be afraid of being negatively evaluated or ridiculed by the audience. So if somebody is negatively evaluating you or ridiculing you, generally that comes down, if you've got that as a fear, you would look at that fear and go, okay, what can I do to handle that fear? And the simplest answer to that is to prepare before you do your presentation. And there are very specific things you need to do to prepare. And we actually do that. I think that's in our next session. So when you're preparing a presentation, if you are well prepared and you've got little phrases like, that's a great question, let me get back to you on a response to that, that gives you the opportunity to overcome that fear. So what you're doing in this process is going from the problem to the solution. So if I'm afraid that someone's going to judge me because they know more than I do, then I've got to prepare so that I've got everything available to me. You could be afraid of making a mistake, forgetting words, stumbling over your words, and being embarrassed. So if that happens, when you do forget your words or you stumble over your words, it's a really simple response to that too. Stop talking. It's called the power of the pause. When you stop talking, you actually get your audience's attention because people respond to silence. And they're like, oh, what's happening? That must be interesting. And they'll actually lean forward and be more engaged in what you're saying. So if you're afraid of making a mistake or forgetting words, one of the most powerful things you can do in your preparation is to build in pauses. And I'll go through that in the next session as well. Pausing helps you to avoid stumbling over the words that you're going to use. And another really powerful tip here to avoid stumbling over your words is to practice out loud. I can't tell you how many of my clients that I've coached that will say to me, yes, I'm really prepared and everything's going really well. And I'll say, great. And I'll say, here's my speech. And they'll email it to me. I'll say, great. Now tell it to me. And then they start to tell me their talk. And all of a sudden, words that are really simple and easy to put together on a piece of paper become tongue twisters that they weren't expecting. So if you're not practicing out loud before you do your presentation, then start to do that because that's a really powerful way of avoiding stumbling over words. Another common fear or anticipation fear is the fear of not meeting expectations or giving a poor performance. And again, that comes down to how you practice. And I say that specifically, how you practice, because just practicing is the difference between, let's say, a kid on a skateboard and somebody at the Olympics on a skateboard. It's the difference between how you put your speech together and how you actually practice it. That's what makes a huge difference to most people's ability to speak confidently. One of the big ones is physical fear symptoms. When I was really really out of my head with nerves about public speaking, I would get this like sweat moustache, which was really attractive, huge pools of sweat in my armpits, even more attractive, and my legs would shake so much that any page I was holding would also shake. It was like this whole, avalanche effect going on in my body. I couldn't actually hold myself still. At the same time, my throat would dry up so much that I couldn't create any saliva, so I physically couldn't form words. So physical symptoms, I'm going to do a whole session on that because I'm so familiar with it and how I overcame that. So those are some of the things that are anticipation fears. How am I going to handle the sweats? How am I going to handle the shakes? How am I going to handle not being able to talk? How am I going to handle the fear of forgetting everything? If you can get all that out on paper as a problem, then you can actually move into the next stage, which is solving the problem. Where people struggle is they don't ever get to the stage where they move on to the solving part because they are stuck in the internal process of worrying about the actual problem. So externalize it, write it down, make sure that you've got all of those fears written down so that you can manage them. Everybody good with that? Give me a yes in the chat or thumbs up. Okay, Kevin says forgetful fear. That's a big one, isn't it? And again, that comes actually down to how you practice, more actually how you prepare your speech and then how you practice your speech. And that's a big one that we're going to cover next time. So yes from Lisa, yes from Jefferson, fabulous. Thank you, Kimberly. Great. All right, so the third and final fear we're going to cover today is good old learned fear. Now, this one has been spawned from some kind of negative experiences in your past, some kind of bad moment or moments that taught you that speaking in public is scary, risky, embarrassing, and dangerous. Now, you might not have articulated that in your head using that language, but that's what your body is feeling. Now, sometimes this is an old fear that's grown up with you from childhood. Other times it's not at a point that you can remember that something specific happened, but you do know that you feel the idea of speaking in public is scary and risky. So it's a learned fear. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that fear of public speaking is a learned behavior and it can be unlearned. So is this a fear that you have? Is that something that's kind of dominant for you in your fear system? Is that thought of speaking because something happened to you in the past? For some people, this will be really easy to identify. They go, yep, I had this experience. It was terrible. I was not confident talking in public in the first place. And after that, I never wanted to do it again. Maybe it's something very specific like that. And if it is, this might rank highly for you in your fear scale. So how do we handle it? The first step is acknowledging it. And what I mean by this is accepting that it has happened. I want to use that language very specifically. I want you to think about that event as being something that has happened. I'm not saying that it was okay that it happened. I'm saying acknowledge that it did happen. Now, the reason this is important is when we acknowledge fear and we recognize and accept it, what we're doing is taking it again from being internal and we're putting it in an external position. So what that means is once you've acknowledged it, instead of just brushing it off and thinking about, wow, yeah, that was a bad experience, so I'm not going to think about that. You actually have the opportunity, once you've acknowledged that fear, to understand the lessons and to recognize the lessons. So let me give you an example of this. Has anybody here ever had a hot beverage of some sort, tea or coffee or hot chocolate or something like that? Anybody ever had a hot beverage? Give me a yes in the chat if you've ever had a hot beverage of any description. Yes from Lisa, thank you. Yes from Kevin. Okay, so when we have a hot beverage, when you pick your hot beverage up, you just go starting to chug it back down the throat? No. Do you know why we don't do that? Because at some point you learnt that tipping your hot beverage up and drinking straight out of the mug, you're going to burn the tip of your tongue or your mouth. So you learnt a lesson from it. But it doesn't mean you never drink a hot beverage again, right? It means you acknowledge, wow, I can't just pick my cup up and take a drink. I have to test it. I have to blow on it. I have to wait for it to cool down. I've learnt a lesson. It's the same principle with learned fear. If you can acknowledge that you had that experience, not that it was okay necessarily, but that you did have it, then you can step into the next stage, which is the lesson stage, which is where you learn how to manage that process next time. So once you shift your perspective from fearing the experience to asking the question of what did I learn, that opens up a whole new world for you. So you can start to reframe it. And what I mean by that is you can start to look at the problem and how you could handle that better next time. So it's about changing the factors that contributed to that experience to prevent it from happening again. So to put this into use the same example. So when you learnt that if you drink your coffee or your tea or your hot chocolate too fast, you burn your mouth, next time you think, okay, this is what I have to do to avoid having that happen again. So think, if you're somebody who learned fear is really high or dominant in your fear cycle, I want you to think about what was it that happened. Take it from internal to external, write it down, and then say, okay, what lessons did I learn from that? Because once you know the lessons, then you can fix it. Then you can get to the point and say, okay, this is what I need to do to fix that. Make sense? Yes? Fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is jump into what we've covered so far and do a quick summary. and then tell you about what we're going to do next time. If you have any specific questions that you would like answered that I haven't covered today, please feel free to drop them in the chat and I will go through those in a couple of minutes. So pop your questions into chat. And what you're going to get from me, there we go, is this. If you are already in the Vocal Power community, then you will get this in the community. You won't need to source it. If you're not in the community, I'm going to share with you in a moment how you can join if it's something that would be useful to you. And I can also have this emailed to you if you stick around to the end. I'll tell you how to do that. So these are the 7 fast ways to beat public speaking fear. This is a little checklist that I have put together so that you can have this anytime you have to do a speech or a presentation of any sort, so that you've got 3 techniques to help you with whatever is your dominant fear at that time. And the thing that's important to understand here is that it won't always be the same fear that pops up every time. There could be something different. So that's why it's going to be all on a little checklist like this. So just to summarize there, for your audience fear, if you're afraid of the audience, remember the audience is not the enemy and they are interested in themselves. So ask yourself the question, how can I help my audience to understand? If you're fearing something that's anticipated, write all of those fears down, observe and analyze them, and then brainstorm solutions. If your fear is a learned fear from a past experience that has caused you to be uncomfortable or feel threatened and unsafe about speaking in public, acknowledge the experience, accept that it has happened, and then reframe the experience. The same as the anticipated fear, take it from internal to external, write it down, and then put in place some checklists or some steps to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Our next categories are credibility fear, otherwise known as imposter syndrome, how to handle when I've forgotten absolutely everything that I prepared, how to handle that performance anxiety fear, and lucky last is physical fear symptoms. And there are some very specific things that you can do to manage the physical fear symptoms. So this is the attached download, and I'm going to get that to you, Lisa. I know you didn't have that, so I'll make sure you get a copy of that. But on this sheet, what I'd like you to do once we go through all of these fears is rank them in order from 1 to 7. And you can reuse this over and over. But as you're sitting down to prepare your speech or your next talk, I want you just to think about, okay, what is it that I'm most conscious of in terms of the fears that I have, and then pop it in order, because then you know the first one you want to address is number 1. So that gives you a good guideline on how to go forward. So in our next session, we're going to cover credibility fear. Now, this one's based on the worry, and this one might sound familiar to you, Jefferson, that everyone is going to find out that you're a fraud, or that you don't know as much about what you're talking about as your audience knows. Now, this fear wraps itself up in the belief that true expertise is somebody who knows everything about a topic, and that is really out of your reach. And everyone's going to know that you're an imposter as soon as you open your mouth and start to talk. So we're actually going to cover that in our next session. So I mentioned to you earlier